I wanted to start this morning by picking up where we left off last week and beginning again with Einstein's wonderful quotation. He says, "There are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle, and the other is as though everything is a miracle." I really like that statement a lot. So we continue this morning with the saga of the evolution of the creation story described so long ago in Genesis. Today we will be adding to the wonder of that story that we began last week. Here's our cosmic timeline. We traveled last week almost 10 billion years through time. We saw how the universe began with a violent expansion into nothingness. Something came from nothing, and stars were born. Galaxies coalesced, and planets, moons, and solar systems sprang forth throughout that early universe. Here we are on our timeline about 4.6 billion years ago. A giant supernova somewhere in the neighborhood of our Milky Way galaxy has recently exploded, spewing forth all the heavy elements that will be needed to create our solar system. Gas, rocks, and debris from that explosion swirled out into space and were slowly gathered into a gigantic spinning disk. Once again, the universe displays this wondrous property of emergence. The chaos of the supernova explosion is collected into the next new thing, a new sun, a new system of planets. So how did all this chaotic debris organize to become a new solar system and eventually lead to the development of life and to us? New solar systems develop from a whirling mass of gas and solid matter called a protoplanetary disk. This disk contains all the junk, dust, debris, and leftover hydrogen gas from that exploding supernova. Included in this slowly spinning disk are all the heavier elements that are needed to form rocky planets, and most importantly, the element of carbon. Through the laws of gravity, the material in this disk forms a sun at the center, and planets begin to form in orbit around that new sun, guided by the laws of gravity described by Isaac Newton in the late 1600s. It took our sun between 100,000 and 1 million years to form after the mother star exploded, and in cosmic time, that's just a blink of an eye. The early Earth was formed as rocky debris collected, and the gravity from that mass attracted even more matter to form a spherical ball. As the mass of the Earth increased, the pressure from the gravity on the material at the center of the Earth melted rocks and all the heavy minerals. Molten iron was quickly compressed to the center of the ball. Early Earth was a boiling, molten mass of magma, plummeted constantly with asteroids from space, leftover pieces of debris from our exploded mother star. Our mother star exploded a little over 4.6 billion years ago, and the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago, so within about 100 million years, which is really a blink of an eye in cosmic time. Our moon is thought to have formed by a glancing blow from a small planet called a planetesimal, although this theory is currently being revisited. Matter from that collision collected in orbit around the early Earth to form our moon. Note that the universe has taken another major step toward complexity. Planets are made up of many kinds of atoms, and the processes on planets are significantly more complex than the makeup of stars. Our solar system is divided into two kinds of planets: the rocky inner planets of Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, and the outer gas giants, the Jovian planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. The outer planets are gaseous because they're so cold the gases become solid. Those outer planets in our solar system, in fact, contain over 99% of all the material orbiting the sun. I want to pause just a second and jump to the present, well, almost the present, just a few hundred years ago. We know today, as illustrated by the previous picture, that our sun is the controlling body of our solar system with all the planets circling the sun in elliptical orbits. But that understanding is a recent one for us. The guy who got it all wrong on the left was Claudius Ptolemaeus, a 2nd century mathematician who lived in Alexandria. Ptolemy can be forgiven for his early work in astronomy, but it was his geocentric theories that the planets and the sun circle the earth that caused so many problems for astronomers and mathematicians for centuries. The great-grandfather of science, Aristotle, in fact, also believed in the geocentric theory. The church was the authority on natural philosophy, as science was called at that time, and they accepted Ptolemy's theories as biblical fact for centuries, and they persecuted those who dared to disagree. Nicholas Copernicus, the gentleman on the right, was a Prussian mathematician who should have gotten credit for the modern understanding of how the solar system worked. In the 16th century, he first formulated the so-called geocentric theory that the planets revolved around the sun. He was so intimidated by the church and fearful of persecution for his theories, many of his writings went underground and were rediscovered by Kepler and Galileo decades later. Johannes Kepler on the left and his contemporary Galileo Galilei on the right read Copernicus's works, and through their own observations, they agreed that he was correct. The Roman Church, which was in the throes of the Reformation at that time, had no patience with Galileo's ideas, challenging the church's position on astronomy. Galileo became a victim of the Roman Inquisition and was tried by the Holy Office and found to be vehemently suspect of heresy. For this, he was forced to recant his theory on astronomy and was spared death, but he spent the last part of his life under house arrest. And as Tom said in the first session, it took the church till 1991 to apologize to Galileo for this. But back to her story. The earth cooled enough to have a solid crust about 4.4 billion years ago. The early atmosphere of ammonia was converted to nitrogen by the sun's energy. Today, although the earth has cooled considerably, we still float on a molten interior of lava. The outer crust we live on is 3 to 6 miles thick, and it rides on a mantle which is 60 to 100 miles thick. Now that might sound very stable, but remember that the Earth's diameter is 8,000 miles. That means that we live on the outer 2% of the Earth's thickness. So we ride on a very thin, solid layer that still has its tectonic plates shown here that are moving and constantly cause earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. We're still bombarded by asteroids, as this 50,000-year-old crater in Arizona shows. The incidence of asteroid strikes is much smaller than in earlier times, but it's still estimated that we have about a 50% chance of a large asteroid strike in the next 100 years, which is a rather sobering thought. Notice how the rhythm of evolution of the cosmos so far has been characterized by creation and then seemingly chaotic destruction, only to be replaced once again by creation. The process seems to take smaller, simple pieces and bring them together to form something that has totally different characteristics from its parts. Take, for example, snowflakes that have beautiful patterns and characteristics not found in water droplets. This is a recently recognized property, which I mentioned last week, called emergence, that seems to pervade the universe, repeatedly taking apart and rebuilding, using simple building blocks to create amazing and wondrous new creations that are much more than the sum of its parts. As some say, something more from nothing but. One blazing hot day on Earth about 4 billion years ago, about 500 million years after the Earth was created, after trillions of chemical experiments in the rich soup of water and gases on the primordial Earth, warmed by the sun and receiving energy from violent lightning storms and from chemical interchanges, something utterly remarkable happened. The powers of emergence created the first life. In a very short time after the formation of the Earth and the other planets, life on Earth began as shown here. And just how did it all start? Well, we're not really sure. There are many theories, and I will mention one of the more dominant theories, but it seems during my presentation that I have presented many instances where science does not have all the answers. Does this uncertainty give you pause? Someone said the grand challenge of life is not to know, rather to embrace uncertainty. It's thought that the very first life was a self-replicating RNA molecule, but we are unsure. Now I'll get a little bit technical. RNA is a molecule in the cells of all life on Earth that works in conjunction with DNA to replicate the various tissues of our bodies. Life today is controlled by the replication process of the DNA molecule, and RNA today plays a helper role. For the creation of the very first life, it is thought, one of the dominant theories is that a self-replicating RNA molecule evolved that was able to bootstrap through evolution the development of the DNA molecule and the entire DNA replication process. The exact details of how life started are shrouded in the mists of time. We are, in fact, carbon-based creatures. And we have already learned that carbon is one of the many heavier elements that is born in the center of a star. We think that if life is ever found on another planet, it is very, very likely to be carbon-based like us. The fact that life started on the one hand was inevitable once the laws of physics of our universe and the environment that the planet Earth inherited were given. However, we are left with a state of awe and reverence for the cosmic evolutionary process that started the cosmos, gave us the solar system, and provided Earth with a rapid evolution of life that led to our species. With the evolution of life, the universe again has taken a leap forward in complexity with the creation of life, forms that continue to evolve today. I wanted to read this comment by this quotation by Ursula Goodenough, who wrote a wonderful little book called The Sacred Depths of Nature. Ursula Goodenough is a biologist who's on the faculty at Washington University in St. Louis. She says, "And so I once again revert to my covenant with mystery and respond to the emergence of life, not with a search for its design or purpose, but instead with an outrageous celebration that it occurred at all. I take the concept of miracle and use it not as a manifestation of divine intervention, but as the astonishing property of emergence. Life does generate something more from nothing but, over and over again, and each emergence, even though fully explainable by chemistry, is nonetheless miraculous." I think that's a wonderful statement. And Brian Swimme puts it slightly differently. He says the primary prayer is one of all, and it is probably the most effective prayer because through it we turn to our origins and just behold with a sense of gratitude. So let's continue our story. One of the many forms that appeared about 4 billion years ago was a cell that somehow discovered how to convert photons of light from the sun into chemical energy. Capturing solar energy, zipping into the cell at the speed of light, the cell was able to invent the biochemical machinery to convert nitrogen compounds into proteins for feeding itself. Photosynthesis had been created. Early cyanobacteria cleaved a water molecule to produce hydrogen, releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. Oxygen, one of the most reactive elements, transformed the primordial atmosphere consisting of ammonia, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide. This disrupted the environment for the earliest forms of life that had developed in this early atmosphere. In the next 2 billion years, the first cells either developed defense mechanisms against oxygen, they learned to exploit it, or they became extinct. The transformation of Earth's atmosphere to include oxygen represented one of the major turning points in the evolution of our planet. The invention of photosynthesis had a profound effect on the evolution of our planet. Not only did it introduce oxygen into our atmosphere, photosynthesis in symbiosis with bacteria living among the roots of plants converts nitrogen in the air into amino acids that are required today for all animal life on Earth. Without plants, we could not exist. Ozone built up, sheltering the Earth from the most energetic rays of the sun, the ultraviolet rays. Evolution of life began to enmesh, sharing the environment, each taking the resources not needed by the other, and each providing an element for the others. Predation occurred early on and involved bacteria and single-celled animals. This particular picture shows a single-celled organism engulfing and consuming another single-celled animal, that cell being the one responsible for the red tides in oceans. Things began to happen quickly now. About 1 billion years ago, a cell invented sexual reproduction, a major step forward in the creation of new life forms. Sexual reproduction ensured that both mating cells will possess the advanced and defining characteristics of the lineage. About 700 million years ago, the first multicellular life forms appeared. So we're now coming very quickly to our present time, even though the numbers are large in geological time. It was just yesterday that this happened. Early plants, about 400 million years ago, sprang forth, flowering forth in many different forms, each tossed out into the great adventure to see what might become of them. They all entered existence. The reign of the dinosaurs occurred 225 to 65 million years ago. And on our timeline, we see that was just yesterday. The first mammal appeared about 216 million years ago. Let's see if I can make this work. This is our common ancestor, the first mammal. Other species of early mammals appeared, especially after the extinction of the dinosaurs, who were the major predators on Earth during their time. This slide shows various categories of animals in the columns moving left to right. And vertically, we see the evolution of various species moving from around 200 million years ago at the bottom of the chart to the present at the top. Extinct species on this chart are shown in black. And I should add that many of the species along the top now are going extinct because of the loss of habitat. All of these creatures are specialized to live in a certain climate, in a certain part of the earth. And when they lose that habitat, and that loss mainly is due to the explosion of the human population, they become extinct. Our recent ancestors, the first primates the first monkeys appeared about 36 million years ago. This is so recent in geological time that the distance on our timeline that I've been showing would not even occupy a pixel on the screen, so I can't even show you that. And we haven't gotten to our species yet. We're several million years away from that. I have to show you a picture of Charles Darwin at this point. This man, Charles Darwin, changed the course of science forever when he introduced his theories of evolution. This is a picture I found that we seldom see of Charles Darwin in the late 1830s, right after he got back from his trip on the Beagle. By the way, I read his biography, and Charles Darwin was seasick the whole trip. And I'm sure he was happy to get home. Even though Darwin's work changed the course of science forever, today, according to a Gallup poll, and I think Tom has quoted this figure, 42% of Americans think that human beings were created in their present form. Yet the evidence for the basic principles of evolution is unquestionable in the scientific community. I think this is a funny. Marlon Lavenhar says, "Don't tell me I'm related to monkeys." Well, the fact of the matter is that now that we have discovered DNA and its code, we know we are not only related to monkeys, we're related to zucchini, so let's get over it. I think that's funny. Our species has appeared in the blink of an eye at evolutionary time. Homo sapiens, our species, arose about 200,000 years ago. We're such a recent development, we can't even begin to represent this tiny distance on our timeline. This is a little bit of a complicated chart, but it shows what we currently know about how we came to evolve from other primates. The blue bars represent species that are in our closest family tree, while the orange bars represent developments of our primate ancestors that led to a different part of the evolutionary tree. Our species is the only one left in the tree. All the others are extinct. How much longer will we survive before we go extinct too? Note the position of Homo habilis, our common ancestor, and I need a pointer here, but the first blue bar is Homo habilis. And then further up the tree, Homo ergaster, which is right above Homo habilis, and also our distant cousin, Boisei, to the far right in the other branch of the tree. This is an artist recreation of Homo habilis developed from the fossils that have been found of our ancestor. Homo habilis using stone tools appeared about 2 million years ago. Here are artist reconstructions of the partial skulls of two of our ancestors represented in the previous evolutionary tree that I pointed out. Boisei was the branch that branched off to the right, and Homo ergaster was one step up from Homo habilis, as you recall. And you can see the difference in the development of the facial structure in these two creatures. This image shows the dissimilarity between our species' DNA and the DNA of other similar species. The red and orange colors show the difference in the base pairs of DNA. Note that we share 99% of the DNA with these other species, and the base pair mismatches have been exaggerated in this slide to demonstrate the differences. The Denisovians are a group of archaic humans related to the Neanderthals. So they're at the bottom of this chart, and you see that we're more closely related to the bonobos and the chimps. And I believe the current thinking is we're probably closer to the bonobos than we are to chimpanzees. And the gorilla branched off in a different direction in the evolutionary tree, so we have more differences with the gorilla species. Brian Swimme remarks that the earth was once molten rock and now it sings opera. I think that's beautiful. Okay, here's our timeline again, and we've come to the end of this part of our journey. Our own journey as a species is so brief in cosmic time, as I've said before, there is no way to represent it on the timeline. I couldn't even put a pixel up. It would be much too big to represent the time that Homo sapiens, our species, has been on the earth. Our species has grown so rapidly in the last 500 to 1,000 years, we now threaten the very planet we evolved on. We have developed language about 40,000 years ago. About 18,000 years ago, we left cave paintings in Europe. We tamed dogs about 10,000 years ago, domesticated cattle about 8,800 years ago. Sumeria in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, arose about 7,000 years ago, and 3,000 years ago, civilizations were arising along the Indus, Nile, and the Tigris-Euphrates valleys. That was the time at the beginning of my presentation last week when we discussed the Genesis story. In the 13.5 billion years of our universe, if it's scaled into a single year, if we took the 13.8 billion years and scaled it into a single year, and the Big Bang happened on January the 1st of that year at midnight, on December the 31st of that year at midnight, the human lifespan would represent 1/4 of a second, just the blink of an eye, to give you some idea of how recent we are. We've come far these past 2 Sundays and covered a lot of ground. Huge questions remain for further discussion in the weeks to come. Tom will discuss the rise of human culture, villages, city-states, nations, and eventually our present development as we continue to evolve as a species and we continue to evolve our social systems. What impact we will have on our planet as our numbers continue to climb, we're not sure. Can we limit ourselves to a sustainable population and a sustainable lifestyle? Time will tell, and we will discuss this and many more things in the coming weeks. Daniel Pinchback says, we are citizens of an evolving cosmos, and our conscious awareness of that places us in a far more implicated relationship to ourselves, to the entire web of life on this planet, and to the future. So that ends my presentation. I hope we'll enter into a conversation, and I've posed some questions here, but the floor will be open to whatever you want to talk about. But one of the things I would like for you to ponder is, for you personally, is there spiritual content in the 21st century creation story that I've covered the last two Sundays? What does this say? What does all of this say to us about ideas about God? What do you make of this concept of emergence, the emergence concept? And lastly, if I see myself as a self-conscious creature of a glorious evolutionary process, does this understanding have any influence on my moral code of ethics? I struggle with the wording of that last one, but I hope you get the meaning. So with that, the floor is open.
Talking about Darwin and his theory of evolution,
yes.
Before he left on this trip, did he have some sort of idea of evolution, or did the concept all come about from the different creatures that he saw on this journey?
Some of you in here may know the answer to that more than I do, but as I recall from reading, and I read his biography several years ago, I think there were ideas floating around at the time that there were others that had looked at fossils and had sort of postulated that what we now know as evolution was an answer to how things came to be. I think Darwin's big contribution was his publication, The Origins of Life? Origins of the Species, thank you. And it kicked off a huge hubbub with the church, of course, and in the scientific community. He had his detractors and he had his supporters. But to answer your question, I don't have names of people, but there were others before that talked about that. So I believe that notion was in his head, was planted in his head. But when he saw the Galapagos and some of the other places he went to, it really crystallized for him that when he saw the specialization of the finches, and he saw the relationship that they had been isolated, and some had changed simply by being isolated on an island. This told him that something was changing, evolving. And
as I recall, Darwin's either his uncle or his grandfather also had some of these same ideas, and I think Darwin must have inherited some of those or gotten some of those ideas from that relative.
Yeah.
The other thing that Darwin brought, of course, was the data. When he came back from his trip on the Beagle, he brought back the data up to the wind. There had been a lot of philosophizing or speculation, but he brought back the data which the scientific theories could be based.
Right.
So that was his enormous contribution.
Just to add to that a little bit, he was a very young man when he made the voyage, but the publication of Origin of the Species was not until much later And he wrote it almost immediately and circulated amongst other naturalists of the time. And it was not until some other people had made similar trips, not as extensive, and were beginning to write down their conclusions, that his friends got together and said, listen, you're not going to be able to prevent the reaction against this because it's coming out. It might as well come out in a better form by you publishing your work on it. Yeah. As far as the bottom one there is concerned, I'm very concerned about that, particularly living in Texas, because I know that politicians find it in their best interest to not work to have us live in a more harmonious relationship with nature because it helps them stay in office.
I wanted to, you triggered something talking about Darwin. This is an interesting story about the trip on the Beagle. Apparently Darwin was involved with a professor at a university, I guess it was, I don't remember. Anyway, his professor was offered this trip on the Beagle. And so he couldn't go for personal reasons, and so he offered it to Darwin. Well, when Darwin's family heard about this, they strictly forbade him to go. They said, you're not going on this trip. And it was only because an uncle interceded and insisted that he be allowed to go that he went. So history is filled with all this serendipitous kind of events that, and if he had not gone, one wonders, it would have been, the evolutionary theory would have come out, but wouldn't have come out the way it did.
I guess Bob and I were talking about the class last week and what our responsibility is in this. Charles, at least to your point, my daughter-in-law works for the comptroller and she protects endangered species, so at least we've made baby steps, right? But in terms of our responsibility, with emergence being a fact, it makes me wonder about global warming, et cetera. I mean, this is not the first drought we've ever had in this part of the world, for sure. And what is our responsibility in the influence of it, or is it a natural phenomenon, since we're not all going to be here forever anyway, and neither is this manifestation of that which we know to be the earth. I just, it's probably, there's no this or that, it's probably both, but I just wonder what our responsibility is in that, because I did leave here feeling very lucky to be alive in these times last week.
Ernie, any comments on that?
I'd rather let others respond.
Others?
But you raise good points.
I think just a couple comments I'd make on it. One is there is difficulty that scientists have in terms of trying to determine exactly what natural causes and what are man-made causes in terms of climate change, because we know that climate change has occurred over eons of time and it's occurring now, but man is adding to it. And what is that component that man is adding to it? And in terms of responsibility, I think we do have a responsibility to those that come after us, our grandchildren and great-great-great-grandchildren, to be caretakers for that from which we came, which is this earth. So while some forces are beyond our control, those that are within our control, I think we have some responsibilities to make intelligent choices about what we do. What those intelligent choices may be are certainly very controversial right now, but it's a good dialogue to have, I think.
I guess I do have a comment on that. I think one of the things that this story did for me was it very clearly told me that I'm integrated with everything in the earth. I think I grew up in a very conservative church in the Deep South, and it was a very anthropocentric kind of upbringing where I thought that humans were at the top of the chain, and everything below that was, we were even taught the Genesis story that we were to use everything, that everything on earth was for our use. And I think now I very much don't believe that. I think we're part of the system. We're coming to understand that in so many different ways that we live in an integrated environment, a natural environment. And for example, the disappearance of the bees caused chaos in the agricultural community because they are the major pollinators. And that's part of our food chain. It's such a simple thing, a little insect that we depend on. So I think that's one of the things that comes out of this story for me is I'm very much part of an integrated environment. And so I begin to look to see, am I living in a society that's sustainable? Are we planning and living in a way that we're looking ahead to a sustainable kind of future, or are we putting our heads in the sands and just ignoring that? And I think too often it's the latter.
Okay, question back here.
In regards to this idea of global warming and what our abilities to do things as human beings, I think of things along the lines of, we were talking about the scale of the universe last time, and just the millions of miles distance between the Earth and the Sun. Yet, the Earth is placed at such a position that if its orbit was off by a matter of feet, it would either be too cold to sustain life or too hot to sustain life as we know it. Even though we're looking at numbers that are mind-boggling, we cannot understand, the alterations that would wreak huge changes are so minuscule, they actually come down to levels that we could alter as human beings. And yes, climate change has happened in the past. There have been various factors for that. But as human beings today, with the amount of production that we have the ability to wreak huge changes on the world around us. They might be for good, they might be for bad, but we have never consciously thought as a race, what are we doing and what can we do to make things better? It's merely, I have a new tool, what can I get from that? And the consequences, to be honest, to be damned.
One of the things that's without dispute is that we're now in the next great extinction period that matches the one that occurred. Tom, you can help me there with the geology. The one that's in the Burgess Shale, the big extinction from a period where we lost like 80% of the creatures on Earth. We're in that extinction period now, and SWIM says it will take 10 million years to replace the species that we've lost in the last 100 years. So there's no question about that, and most of that's loss of habitat. There are too many of us. And so there are different ways to look at that. You say, well, that's part of evolution. We're driving evolution. We'll go on to the next thing. Or, if you preservationist, you can say, well, it's important to preserve that. And so it depends on how we react to those facts, I think is important as part of the story.
I teach a class kind of that deals with this. I think the World Wildlife Fund said we've lost about half our species in the last half a century. But in regards to animals, there's now research this year that mice have empathy, elephants have funeral ceremonies, lots of animals can grieve. Some species are self-aware. I mean, chimpanzees, there's even chimpanzee that can teach American Sign Language to their young. So I mean, our capacity and difference, we have that 1% DNA difference between us and our closest ancestors, but our ability to tell a story. At this point, we have to start taking charge of that story and changing that story if we're going to survive.
Thank you. Other comments? Brian?
Yeah, we talked about how humanity adversely affects the natural process through climate change, but humanity also has a positive impact on the natural process through the scientific research of companies like Monsanto. Do you have any moral issues with what Monsanto's doing, or do you think they're making a positive contribution?
You're just going to get me, aren't you? You keep throwing these grenades at me. Yeah, I do. I mean, some of the things that Monsanto is doing are pretty questionable. I mean, they tried, I think, well, that was Delta Pine Land that tried to, decided that they were going to patent, what is the Indian rice species? No, it wasn't quinoa. But anyway, I mean, it was ridiculous. But and creating seeds that farmers in third world countries are not allowed to get seed stock from, but rather have to buy new seeds from Monsanto. Where we're talking about subsistence farmers, that's not a good thing. But yeah, I don't know. In a broader sense, we're really into the realm of philosophy now, and too bad Bob's not here. But I think you could argue that science is a zero-sum game, and you're saying it's not a zero-sum game. Others would say that it's a zero-sum game. For all the good it's done, it's created other. But my response to that personally is it's humans who utilize the outcome of science in technology, mainly technology. And so it's our moral responsibility to be wise stewards of that technology, and sometimes we're not. Look at the way we plan cities. Look at the metroplex we live in. Out of over 12 million acres of prairie, there are 4,500 acres left. I don't know what percentage that is. I can't do that in my head. But we've eaten the prairie in Texas. There's none left. You could say, well, who cares? That's fair, I guess. But the fact is that we don't think in terms of we haven't thought in terms of sustainability until very recently. It's a recent phenomenon. But that is just my opinion. I don't want to foist this off on my co-authors.
Interesting thing is, Homo sapiens means wise humans. I think maybe we ought to be called Homo not sapiens. Who's got to come in? I saw some.
My concern is we feel our obligation, but we're only such a small percentage. There's millions and millions of people that don't even ever think about this.
All right, that's right.
So,
that's why I'm glad we're putting this on YouTube. No, seriously, I think we're, in some sense, our presentation is aimed at preaching to the choir here in this church, and I think I'm glad we have a broader audience.
I think the other comment I would make on that, Mona, is how fortunate we are that we are positioned to be able to consider those kinds of questions when there are billions of people in this world that are fighting every day for survival. And it's awfully difficult to think about these kind of questions when you're not sure where your next meal's coming from or whether you're going to live for another year or not. I saw some hands raised back here. Someone else?
Oh, I had a quick comment.
Just a springboard off of what Ernie said, who cares about the loss of the prairies? Well, from your presentation, if we need plants to live, we're all going to care about that if we get rid of the plants, which is obvious, but it's worth stating.
Well, I think, too, we're finding that this whole integration business, we're finding more and more out. We still don't know everything in science. We're still finding out a lot of stuff. We're just now finding out how important the integrated nature of everything is. And so we really don't know what the outcome will be of losing something like the prairie or some species that we don't see any obvious use for or connection with. And we may find out down the road somewhere that was a very key thing. The more you read this stuff, the more wondrous it becomes. Everything developed over millions of years to work together. And then all of a sudden, exploding on the scene is our species. And we have literally that graph I showed of our population. We have dominated. We're the dominant predator. We've dominated the scene, and so it changed everything. And I think it's really important to realize how recent we are. We're so very recent. And the other thing is our lifespan is such a short lifespan. I had an argument with a family member who doesn't believe in evolution, and she said, well, why don't I see change? If we had evolution, I'd be seeing things changing. And I said, but you only live 70 or 80 years or 90 years if you're lucky. And she said, well, it takes hundreds and thousands of generations for these processes to evolve. And so you have to really look at these millions of years and tens and hundreds of millions of years where things have gone on without us and things have evolved. And then bang, here we are. So it's really important to get that. Charles, I'm sorry.
I just thought after your presentation the last 2 Sundays, if we're foolish enough to cause our own destruction as a species as time goes on, maybe it won't be that big a loss.
There's a philosophical thought for you.
Thank you, Charles.
I mean, given the population growth, how is this going to get fixed?
Oh, nature will take care of it. Nature is very indifferent to our species. It doesn't really care whether we, if, let's just say, for example, that the worries about CO2 release are worse than we think, and so we wipe out almost everything. Give it a couple 100 million years, something else will come along. Evolution is going. It is going. It doesn't. We're just part of. We're in the stream swimming, and we have a lot of control in that, in how we live and how we impact the environment. The fact is that the laws of nature are set. We don't change those laws. We live within those laws, and if we disappear, I would love to come back in 10 million years. I would love to come back and see what creatures have evolved from us. We will evolve. Unless we totally disappear. And then something else will come along.
Just so we don't get too far down this road of thinking, it's all hopeless and things could get any worse. Just think of the early processes that Ernie talked about, where the very early plants generated oxygen and put it into the atmosphere. And oxygen is toxic for most life at that time. In fact, it killed off most of the life that was on Earth at that time, because oxygen is so reactive and so toxic. And yet what came out of that were species that could use oxygen, breathe oxygen, and here we are. So now you may say, well, is that progress or not? Well, I know that's what Charles is thinking. But there is, and there have been, catastrophic events that have occurred prior to human history and throughout human history. The emergence from that has been more diversity and a continuing creativity. And that's, I think, the point that Ernie's made, and I'll make on the talks that I'm going to be giving in the next few weeks. By the way, next week, I'll be giving the first of my talks on human evolution, and I'll be going into genetics. And I'll going into it from the standpoint of how we use genetics to understand how people populated the earth, and also into what it's all about in terms of the genetic heritage and how it becomes a part of our social behavior and our culture and the interactions between the two. So I hope you'll all make it back here next week. I've got a fairly long presentation, and I hope you'll be here by 9:30 and we'll start promptly. Thank you all very much.